Welcome and thank you for joining me for Tax Break. This is a podcast about South African tax for South African tax professionals and practitioners. My name is Pieter van der Zwaan, and in each episode I share my thoughts with you on a topic or a recent development in South African tax. And I try to keep the episodes short enough that you can listen to them whenever you've got a few minutes to spare. Today we're talking about a topic that comes up surprisingly often, and that is VAT and agency relationships. So the idea is not to talk about all the practical permutations and scenarios that can arise. I would rather want to talk about just look at the core provisions of the VAT Act and what the law says about this. So if we look at the VAT Act, Section 54 of the VAT Act deals with agents and auctioneers. If we delve into that a bit, subsections 1 to 3 as well as 6 deal with agency, 4 and 5 deal with auctioneers. That's a special type of agency arrangement with its own rules and regime. And if we go into it a bit more, a bit deeper, subsections 2A, 2B, 2C, and 6 deal with certain cross-border agency type of relationships that exist. So the idea is not to go into these, let's call it more specialized types of arrangements, but rather to look at the basic principles that would underpin agency relationships from a VAT perspective. So I think the right place to start is to ask ourselves, what exactly is an agent, or when does an agency relationship exist for VAT purposes? Now, importantly, this concept is not defined in Section 1 of the VAT Act. It's also not defined in Section 54 of the VAT Act, which means that an agent, whether someone is an agent or not, would depend on the normal, ordinary meaning of that term. And seeing that it is a legal concept, whether someone is an agent or not, it is really to a large extent a legal question. Now, it is also important to bear in mind that when it comes to whether an agency relationship exists or not, that is one of the aspects where SARS may reject a request for a ruling. I would suspect because it's really a legal question, and it's a legal question that is highly fact-specific or fact-dependent. Okay, assuming someone is an agent in the legal sense and there is an agency relationship that can be proven, what are the VAT implications of that then? Now, the first implication we find in Section 54(1), which says that if an agent makes a supply on behalf of a principal, the principal is deemed to make the supply, not the agent. Why is that important? It means that the VAT on that transaction must be accounted for by the principal on its VAT 201 return. And related to this, any input tax that relates to this taxable supply must be claimed by the principal, not by the agent. Section 54(1) then continues to say that if the supply that we are looking at is a taxable supply and the agent is a vendor, the agent may issue a tax invoice, a debit note, or a credit note with its own details on it, despite the supply being deemed to be made by the principal. And in that case, the principal may not issue the document again. So from a documentation perspective, it may seem as if the agent made the supply, but Section 54(1) then deems that the supply was made and should be accounted for by the principal. If we look at the other side of the equation, so goods or services being supplied to a principal, Section 54(2) there specifies there that if a taxable supply is made to an agent on behalf of a principal, that supply is deemed to be made to the principal. Again, the agent may request that the documentation be prepared as if the supply is made to the agent. So you could have a scenario where the supply is made to the principal or deemed to be made to the principal because of the agency relationship, but the documentation looks as if it was made to the agent. So that then takes us to subsection 3, which specifies that if the documentation, so in other words, the invoices, the debit notes, the credit notes, the bills of entry, has got the details of the agent on it, so it was issued by or to the agent must maintain records with specific detail in it and notify the principal within 21 days of the month following that supply of these details. So in other words, if the documentation is in the name of the agent, then there must be a notification by the agent to the principal of these transactions that were concluded with its name with the agent's name on the documents. So what that practically means is that agency would typically not be something where one party claimed input tax on an invoice with the details of another person on it, and then be able to claim agency when SARS starts querying why did you claim the input tax, unless you do have an agency arrangement in place and all the notifications have happened as required. So the notifications is actually part of the audit trail that would evidence the existence of this agency relationship. In reality, and in my experience, there's often quite a fine line, and it becomes a bit of a fuzzy distinction between an agency relationship, recovery of costs from another person, and subcontracting and outsourcing arrangements. And I think that is often where the VAT becomes quite complex. So we haven't dealt with the latter two, cost recoveries and subcontracting or outsourcing, but hopefully I've given you something to think about when it comes to the agency type of transactions. So I think to close off, if there is an agency relationship that exists, documentation would become very important. And it's important in a number of ways. Firstly, to prove the existence of that relationship, that there is in fact an agency relationship in place, to make sure you've got the correct documents for the correct party, in other words, the principal to account for the VAT or to claim the input tax. And thirdly, then, if the agent's details are on the documents, to then do the required notifications within the time period specified in the VAT Act, because that's part of the documentation trail that you need to comply with these obligations for the principal to have the information to declare on its VAT returns. That's it for today's episode. If you've got any questions or comments, please send me an email. If you like the podcast, please forward the link to this episode or any other episode for that matter to someone else that you think might also be interested. It's always nice to see the listener base growing bit by bit every week. So I would very much appreciate if you forward the link to someone else. And just a reminder, as always, nothing in this episode was intended to be tax advice or a replacement for tax advice. Until next time, goodbye.